Good afternoon, and depending on where you are, good evening, and hello to you wherever you are, and including if you are joining us via a live stream in a time zone that might be very different from that of Southern California. And a hearty welcome to all of you who watch this on a day other than December 12th, 21. I'm Mary Miller, Director of the Getty Research Institute, the GRI, and we acknowledge our presence today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. I'm reminded that exactly 365 days ago, we hosted this event exclusively on Zoom. We know we have quite a strong Zoom audience today, and I was in my kitchen on that day. Our speaker was in Paris. Our interlocutor was in North Carolina. I have to say, it is a wonderful thing to be here in person with so many of you. We have today in our audience many members of the Getty Research Institute Council, and I want to thank the Council for establishing this lectureship in honor of Thomas and Barbara Gaetkens. We're closing in on, maybe this is lecture 5 or in the Thomas and Barbara Gaetkens series, which chart new pathways in art history and visual culture. Here to tell you more and to welcome our speaker is Winston Moore, the chair of the Getty Research Institute Council. Winston?
Thank you, Mary. We're honored to have Dr. Maria Lowe as our speaker today. Dr. Lowe is a professor of art history at the City University of New York, Hunter College. Dr. Lowe has studied in Canada and France and received her PhD from the University of Toronto. While studying for her PhD, she was a resident fellow at the GRI for 2 years. So she's very familiar with the GRI collections and the work that's done here. Dr. Lowe has received numerous awards for her scholarship and has been a visiting professor and/or fellow at Oxford University in the Villa I Tatti, Harvard Center for Renaissance Art in Florence, Italy. Dr. Lowe has written 3 books on old masters in Renaissance art and philosophy. In her 4th book, which is entitled Liquid Sky, which will explore visual representation of the early modern period. So I would like to ask everybody to welcome Dr. Lowe as she presents her lecture in honor of Thomas and Barbara Gaetkens, who were so instrumental in expanding the Getty Research Institute's scope and scale to a worldwide representation and understanding of visual and art culture. Please welcome Dr. Lowe.
Hello, everyone. Let me begin by saying how excited and grateful I am to be here. I first came to the Getty over, 20 years ago as a graduate student, and it is such an honor to return to the Harold Williams Auditorium today for what is my first in-person lecture since the pandemic. Before I start, I would like to thank Thomas and Barbara Gaetkens and the Council for generously funding this lecture series, and to Mary Miller and Andrew Perchuk for their kind invitation. I'm also humbled by the number of people it took to sort out the ever-shifting logistics of this event, including Melissa Piper, Jennifer De La Fuente, Chelsea Anderson, and Annie Coombs Brooks, among others. And finally, I would like to welcome the audience here in Los Angeles in the auditorium, and to those joining from different places and time zones, and perhaps even in the future. Okay, so let's get started. Rainbow Power. Today's talk will be divided into 3 sections. I will begin with an introduction of how rainbow power manifests itself in our own times. In part 2, we will then look at the rainbow emblem adopted by Catherine de' Medici, the French queen of Italian origin. And in the final section, we will examine rainbow imagery under the early Stuart monarchy in England. Before we begin, let me state my 2 key points clearly. Let's cut to the chase. First of all, rainbows are and have always been political. they've been political symbols from the start. And two, having said that, I might then adjust and say that they are deeply ambivalent signs. While some rainbows can be warm and fuzzy, others can be passive-aggressive and even outright terrifying. The question I would like us to keep in mind this afternoon is the following. How does our comprehension of the past inform our experience of the present? And how can the present enhance our experience of the past? It is easy for us to say history matters, but let me demonstrate to you this afternoon how and why. To do so, let me proceed by turning to an unlikely arena. European Champions League football, or soccer. Inspiration, after all, can come from unexpected places. So in the summer of 2021, UEFA rejected a request made by the mayor of Munich to light the local arena in the colors of the rainbow during an upcoming match between Germany and Hungary. The reasons for the decision were complicated, but might be boiled down to UEFA's fear of offending the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orbán, whose government had just that week outlawed the inclusion of any discussion of LGBTQ rights in schools and on children's television, equating such exchanges with pedophilia. He was also expected to attend the match, but canceled at the last minute. The end result was that fans across Germany and the rest of the world found ways to make up for the ban. A protester even managed to run onto the pitch with a rainbow flag during the singing of the Hungarian national anthem, and let's all note that he's also masked. In an effort to appease right-minded folk disappointed by UEFA's lily-livered decision, UEFA posted an official statement that began, "UEFA respects the rainbow," and ended with the claim that the rainbow is not a political symbol, but a sign of our firm commitment to a more diverse and inclusive society, end quote. Okay, so I won't go into the limp doublespeak at play here. The announcement was met with widespread criticism at the time. Investigations and fines resulted, and if there are any sports fans in the room, and if anyone is interested, I will be happy to talk more about the complex timeline of this story later. I did an insane amount of research on this and then thought not relevant, not immediately relevant. We only have so much time today. Okay, so beyond the optics of the false-hearted gesture, what annoyed me most was UEFA's fanciful insistence that the rainbow is not a political symbol. The controversy that erupted clearly confirmed rather than disproved the fact that it is. As a historian of the Renaissance and as a nerd, I wanted to remind the PR people at UEFA that the multicolored arc has long been an especially powerful symbol for political defiance in Germany. In the 16th century, it was associated with the Peasants' War that erupted in the summer of 1524 in and around Bavaria, where Munich is located then as now. It would later become the insignia of the anti-elite, anti-papal, anti-Lutheran, apocalyptic Protestant reformer Thomas Müntzer, who designed a rainbow banner nearly 100 feet in length that he hung next to the pulpit in the Church of St. Mary in Mühlhausen. In this early 18th century print that we see on screen, we can find the voluminous flag unfurling like a sail against the sky in the upper register. But beneath what seems at first to be two figures praying turns out upon closer analysis to be an execution scene, as the symbolism quickly flutters from hope to terror. The ambivalent celestial sign was connected to Müntzer in more ways than one. On May 14th, 1525, on the eve of the ill-fated Battle of Frankenhausen, as the charismatic preacher was rallying the peasant armies, a rainbow suddenly appeared in the dark and stormy skies, and this we know from various eyewitness accounts on the field. They took it as a sign of God's approval, but when they were subsequently crushed by the well-funded armies of their princely overlords, it came to be seen in retrospect as a bad omen. On screen here is a late 20th century panorama known as the early bourgeois revolution in Germany, recreating the scene. It's a kind of fantastic 360-degree panorama painting in Germany. Okay, I'm obviously not so crazy as to expect anyone at UEFA to have known about this arcane symbolism. But as a historian, I am telling you today because I want us to keep in mind that rainbows have always been political, and they can be political in more ways than one. And this brings us to our first case study. Excuse me. Haven't spoken in public while standing for so long. Okay, unlike UEFA, early modern men and women understood the rainbow to be a formidable symbol of political power. The Protestant Queen of England, Elizabeth I, held one in her portrait, which was accompanied by the inscription in orange, "Without the sun, there is no rainbow." The last of the Tudor monarchs, it was her crafty and rapacious investment in the Americas to the west and in Asia to the east that enabled the creation of an empire in which the sun never sets. In this instance on screen, however, the rainbow is also a sign of mercy and justice. We hear in Genesis, Book 9, verse 13, God's promise to Noah not to submerge the world again in a watery grave. And I quote from the Old Testament, "I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth," end quote. Likewise, Elizabeth I proffers the golden bow as a sign of reconciliation to both Protestants and Catholics. But do not take this queen for a fool. This is not a warm and fuzzy rainbow. The motto in Latin, non sine sole iris, suggests that the regent is both the source of and the vector of her own power, both the head of the Church of England and the monarch of the state. Ruling as the unwed Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I successfully maintained peace within the kingdom while protecting it from external enemies for over 4 decades. So in contemporary terms, that's 3 Angela Merkels. And while she upheld a certain degree of religious tolerance in her political policies, the attentive viewer of this painting will also notice a sea of eyes and ears floating on the Queen's fiery orange robe, watching and listening for sedition. My favorite Protestant rainbow, and shouldn't we all have one, is the tricolored bridge that stretches across the composition in Adrian van de Ven's early 17th century political satire in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. In this crowded scene here, we see Protestants and Catholics battling or fishing for souls, as the title indicates. We'll come back to this image later, but I wanted to give you a sneak preview here at the start. You might ask yourself, were all early modern rainbows Protestant? Well, of course not. Rainbows were bipartisan icons. Sometimes they were even a little less militant, though no less political. Catherine de' Medici, for instance, adopted the symbol of peace as her personal impresa upon her arrival in France as a new bride. On screen is a miniature by François Clouet showing husband and wife. But let me provide you with some biographical background here. For Catherine the Great was the great-granddaughter of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the most famous of the Medici patrons of the Renaissance. She was also the last legitimate bloodline descendant of the senior branch of the House of Medici that began with Giovanni de' Medici. She was an only child, although her father, Lorenzo II, did have an illegitimate child, a son with an enslaved woman of African descent who worked in the Medici household. That child, Alessandro, was her half-brother. But in 1519, before Catherine was even 1 month old, both of her parents passed away in rapid succession, and she would be orphaned. She was raised by her aunt Clarice de' Medici in a household with Clarice's own children, as well as the 2 Medici bastards. Alessandro, whom we've already met, would later go on to become the first Duke of Florence in 1532. And for those of you in the room who might be, and in the world on the metaverse, who might be curious about Alessandro's story, The actress and director, Daphne De Cinto, recently made a wonderful crowd-funded short called Il Moro. So if there are any Hollywood producers, either here in the room today or out in Zoom land, please, somebody find her and turn this wonderful short into a Netflix series for us all. But to get back to Catherine, her other childhood companion was the illegitimate son of Giuliano II de' Medici. She was by many accounts quite smitten by Ippolito, but her great uncle, the Medici Pope Clement VII, who was himself the bastard son of another man, also Giuliano, had other plans for her. Catherine was transferred from Florence to Rome, and in 1531, the Pope arranged for her to marry the second in line to the French crown, Henry II from the House of Valois. Okay, I know, let's just step back, that's a lot of names. Don't worry, you won't be quizzed on any of these people. I am simply plotting them out so that you will understand just how little control a Medici princess had over her own life. And so you can see why the rainbow was such an appropriate choice for her during those early years in France. The Medici-Valois union was a vow to establish peace between two great nations. This was quite a charge for the then 14-year-old Catherine. When she finally arrived in France, she had to contend not only with the influence and popularity of her new husband's long-standing mistress, Diane of Poitiers, but she also had to navigate the icy waters of religious discord between the Catholics and French Protestants, or Huguenots. In this regard, Catherine was more of a diplomat and a political agent than a starry-eyed princess of the kind we find in fairy tales. The historian Sheila Folliot summarized this condition best when she wrote, and I'm quoting her here, "Early modern royal marriage customarily entailed the exchange of women across national borders. Many future queen consorts left home in their teens to take up residence in a foreign country. Most never saw their parents or siblings again, and documents occasionally revealed their separation anxiety. Their welcome often involved lavish expense and demonstrations of deference, but remained a double-edged sword because many marriages resulted from treatises concluding wars," end quote. Perhaps on account of the endless chasms Catherine was expected to bridge, the insignia of the teenage queen, the rainbow, is often accompanied by affirmative mantras such as, "Light brings peace, beneath hardship there is hope," and "One cannot fly without wings," which refers to the wings of Iris, the goddess of the rainbow. So we find her device here in stained glass windows, in floor tiles, in iron door bolts, and on architectural details at the Château d'Écouen, just outside of Paris. For those of you who might want to visit the Château d'Écouen, it is now today the National Museum for the Renaissance in France, and a wonderful day trip outside of Paris. To get back to Catherine again, her rainbow pops up on commemorative coins, such as these we see on the screen, as well as in printed books or collections of emblems. This one is by the French author Claude Paradin. For those of you unfamiliar with Renaissance emblems, let me just offer a very quick explanation. These delightful, nerdy word image puzzles became very popular in Italy in the 1530s. They were then widely collected and distributed through printed books all over Europe. An emblem usually consists of a picture, as we see here, accompanied by a pithy motto, usually in Latin, sometimes in vernacular languages, but in this instance in Greek, and an epigram or poem that frequently conveys a moral message or an explanation. Prominent people had personal emblems, which they would sometimes incorporate into their possessions and surroundings like a logo. Emblems were all the rage. Mary, Queen of Scots, embroidered an entire series of them. In fact, she picked up her love for them in France when she was briefly married to Catherine's first son, Francois II. But when Francois II died unexpectedly in 1560, the Arch-Catholic Mary returned to Scotland and was later imprisoned by her cousin, the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I. These embroideries, known as the Marian hangings, were made during her confinement. In this one, which Mary made for the Countess of Shrewsbury, she copies an emblem from Paradin's book that shows a thirsty and crafty bird filling a jar with pebbles in order to reach the water. The Latin inscription reads, "The bestower of wit," a lovely compliment to her guardian. Paradin, of course, was careful to note when certain emblems belong to very, very important people. At the bottom we read, Madame Catherine, the very Christian Queen of France, has as her device the celestial ark, or the ark in the sky, which is the true sign of pure serenity and tranquility of peace. It is often said that Catherine used rainbow imagery less frequently after the death of her husband in 1559, when she adopted a different one, more in tune with her status as a widow. That said, the rainbow still sneaks into her official imagery here and there. In addition to associating the queen with peace, the rainbow also linked her with fertility. In one of the medals that I showed you previously, we see her as a bow whose rain fertilizes the earth beneath, producing hardy young saplings, which in this image, of course, represent her children. A historical sidebar, Catherine had 10 children in 12 years. For Catherine, the symbolism of her rainbow emblem was personal, but the personal was also profoundly political. If the teenage queen's friendship bow was meant to be warm and fuzzy, the ones that came later were not always so. If I manage to finish my lecture in time, which I hope to, I encourage you all to go to the North Pavilion as quickly as you can, where you will find in the very first gallery, Gallery 102, 2 small enamel plaques. In the one on the right, Catherine appears as the goddess Juno. In the other, we find a portrait of Charles IX as Mars, the god of war. Mars was Juno's son, as Charles was Catherine's. These allegorical portraits of mother and child were made in 1573, when he was the reigning king of France. It has been proposed that these paintings celebrate Catherine's role in forging a temporary peace during the French Wars of Religion. The treaty, or the Peace of Saint-Germain, dating to 1570, has been mentioned in this regard. I wonder if I might be permitted, while standing at the Getty, to revisit this interpretation. For if the dating of 1573 is correct, then we are some years into the bloodiest phase of the French Civil Wars. In 1572, Charles IX married off his sister to the pro-Protestant House of Bourbon in an attempt to broker peace. Instead, it turned out to be a mess. The union led to the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, in which thousands of Protestants in Paris and other parts of France as well were slaughtered. The painting on screen here was made to document the savagery of the Catholic suppression. In the background, we see Catherine dressed in her black widow's robes, larger than life, emerging from the Louvre to inspect a pile of dead bodies. In the foreground to the right, meanwhile, the figure in white being thrown out of the window is Gaspard Coligny, an important Protestant leader who was assassinated that evening or that morning, and whose body was mutilated by the mob, which we see in the detail below. So if the allegorical portraits were painted in 1573, they may have been celebrating, or marking, in fact, the Edict of Boulogne. Signed in the summer of that year, it brought a temporary cessation in violence against the Huguenots, but it also restricted their practice to the 3 cities of La Rochelle, Nîmes, and Montauban. Anywhere else in France, it was illegal to be a Protestant. If we look closely in the landscape beneath the French king, we will find a scene of mayhem that ultimately delivers peace on the other side, but one achieved through great bloodshed and oppression. Now, standing in the gallery at the Getty, the delicate portraits of the king and his mother, you will notice, are painted in polychrome enamel on copper and silver plates, which makes the colors almost shimmer on the surface. Yet despite its joyous pastel palette, this again is not a warm and fuzzy rainbow. In fact, it is a furious spectrum that slaps down to crush the enemy. Some of you might be wondering, well, would 16th century viewers have been aware of this? The visually literate certainly would have been, and by that I mean people like yourselves, conversant with the arts. Limousin's composition repeats a well-known pre-existing motif, showing Juno, the fearsome wife of Jupiter, and the bellicose, no-nonsense queen of the gods. Here on screen, we see her on a gorgeous 16th century maiolico bowl on the right, in an engraving on the top left, and beneath that in a drawing by Raphael, which probably provided the model for the printmaker who probably inspired the potter. And I'm showing you this range of objects to give you an indication of just how quickly images could move and morph and shift from one format to another in the age before Instagram. But why did Limousin choose this image? Or more importantly, the question we might ask is, what does his choice imply? This motif of Juno is based on a scene from Virgil's Aeneid, in which an enraged queen of the gods, Juno, instructs the king of the winds, Aeolus, to obliterate the Trojan forces in the war against the Greeks. For historical viewers, either Catholic or Protestant, standing in the blood-stained shadow of the massacre that would set off the Fourth War of Religion in France, how could they not see recent events reflected, for better or worse, in Limousin's small paintings? The Protestant Revolution that began with men such as Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Thomas Müntzer became a pan-European power struggle for much of the 16th and well into the 17th centuries. In 1588, the navies of Elizabeth I defeated Philip II in the Spanish Armada, dealing the Catholic factions a sorry loss. In the summer of 1593, however, the Protestant heir to the French throne, Henry IV, agreed to convert to Catholicism in order to establish a more enduring peace in the kingdom. Paris, he famously quipped, is worth a mass. So it is against this highly explosive late 16th century context that we arrive at Henry Peacham's rainbow emblem, designed for the new Stuart monarch in England. Moments of dynastic change are always exciting times for artists in search of patronage. Between 1603 and 1610, Peacham devised numerous emblems inspired by a book known as the Basilican Doron, which is Greek for the royal gift or the king's gift, and was written by King James himself. In the pages of two of the surviving hand-drawn manuscripts that we see on screen, we find versions of the same emblem that accompanied a passage from the Basilican Doron. The page on the left was intended for James. The one on the right was another version painted in watercolors and presented to Prince Henry in 1610. So one for father and one for son. In both instances, the same passage about the severity of justice from King James's book appears at the bottom like a footnote, and that's the text down there, which I will read to you. So this passage is taken from the king's own book, the Basilican Doron, and he writes there, or Peacham quotes James here, "When you have, by the severity of justice, once settled your countries and made them know that you can strike, then may you thereafter, for all the days of your life, mix justice with mercy, punishing or sparing, as you shall find the crime to have been willfully or rashly committed." So that's a direct quote from the king to flatter the monarchs. In response to the king's words of wisdom, Peacham then crafted his own Latin motto, "Even in harshness there is mercy," to go along with the picture. Now, the passive aggressivity of the rainbow is then reiterated by Peacham in a Latin poem in the epigram, which is slightly different in the two versions, but I will read the one that was dedicated to the king. Peacham writes, "The wrath of God, sated now by slaughter, rested after water flooded the monstrous iniquity of the world. And then Iris, the rainbow, smiled with rosy countenance from the clouds and came as a clear messenger of the appeased deity." So in the emblem on the left, we can just about see Noah's Ark nestled at the hilltop beneath the thunderous storm that the rainbow is attempting to contain. And here, again, we encounter the ambivalent nature of this celestial sign. In early modern dictionaries of symbols, in fact, we find the personification of judgment portrayed as an old man precariously balancing on a volatile celestial arch with measuring instruments in his hands. If we look back to medieval and Renaissance imagery, rainbows appear most commonly in scenes of the Last Judgment. This is, of course, Giotto's famous fresco in Padua in the Scrovegni Chapel. They also appear in illustrations of the apocalypse. And these are two different images, a print on the right and a painting, a wing from a altarpiece on the left. And this is just a detail, so you can see the Lamb of God breaking open the seven seals that releases the apocalypse. So if we think about these images, we are definitely in the territory of Thomas Münzner's apocalyptic flag and Catherine de Medici's late-life rainbow imagery. But if the anarchic reformer and the French queen exploited their devices to the fullest, neither the king nor his son ever took up Peacham's emblem for personal use. This impasse might make further consideration moot. But what might otherwise seem like a small, insignificant illustration of a rainbow can tell us a lot about the hopes and anxieties not only of the new Stuart king, but of his subjects. And it is to this larger affective history that we will now turn in the final section. A rainbow might seem like an appropriate symbol for King James VI and I, for he was seen as a unifier. In the 1570s and 80s, he successfully contained numerous blood feuds between rivaling families in Scotland. In the 1590s, he introduced legal procedures such as homage, assignment, letters of slains, etc., for conflict resolution. These procedures ultimately empowered the role of the king and his privy council, as well as lawyers, at the expense of the embittered barons and clan chiefs. It was a means of peace by paperwork. When he ascended to the English throne, he pushed for an armistice with Catholic Spain. Elizabeth I's ministers had, in fact, laid the grounds for this. But because the ratification of the Treaty of London took place under James I's watch, he ended up taking most of the credit and came to be known as Rex Pacificus, the peacemaking king. On screen here is a delightful group portrait of the meeting between the English and Spanish delegations on the occasion of the ratification of the Treaty of London. But perhaps I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, and perhaps I should back up a little and better introduce the new monarch to the non-specialists here in the room and elsewhere. For starters, some of you might be wondering, why is the king sometimes referred to King James VI and first? Well, when James Charles Stuart woke up on March 26, 1603, he was still James VI, the King of Scotland, a title he had inherited from his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, whom we met earlier. By that evening, however, he would become James I, King of Scotland, England, and Ireland. He was James VI in Scotland because his grandfather had been James V. But as he was the first king in England to bear that name, he thus became James I. Elizabeth I had passed away 3 days earlier, but it took the royal messenger, Sir Richard Carey, that long to make the journey from London up to Holyrood Palace in Scotland with the official announcement. In the decade before the death of the childless queen, the issue of succession had become an extremely contentious problem as Catholic and Protestant parties attempted to manipulate the process. Not only did Elizabeth I refuse to publicly designate an official heir, she passed a law banning any discussion of the issue in public so as to quell the storm of pamphlets, succession tracts, and other conspiracy theories flying out of the presses. On screen here, we see a Jesuit tract written by Robert Persons under the pseudonym R. Dolman. I guess we would refer to that as a handle now, which was full of inflammatory disinformation aimed at discrediting James in favor of a Catholic candidate. There were actually about a dozen contenders waiting in the wings, but James was pretty confident, for he possessed an abundance of privileges. He was a man. He was already a king in Scotland. By 1594, he had already a male heir of his own, and above all, he was a Protestant. He was also obedient to Elizabeth I. In 1586, when James's mother, Mary Queen of Scots, got caught up in the Babington plot, a botched Catholic conspiracy to assassinate the Queen and restore Mary as the rightful monarch, James wrote a carefully worded letter of protest to Elizabeth to ask for clemency on his mother's behalf. But as Andrea Clark noted recently, and I quote, "With one eye already fixed on the English throne, James was not prepared to go as far as to threaten to break the Anglo-Scottish alliance to save his mother," end quote. This seems especially harsh, but again, it's complicated. History always is. James was the son of his mother's second husband, Lord Darnley Henry Stuart, who was, as many suspected at the time, murdered by her kidnapper, potential rapist, and eventual third husband, the Earl of Bothwell, James Hepburn, who would later himself be chased out of Scotland, leaving Mary to flee to England in 1568. At 13 months of age, James was crowned the King of Scotland, raised in isolation at Stirling Castle by the Earl of Mar and his wife, and educated by the strict Presbyterian scholar George Buchanan, who openly loathed the king's Catholic mother. Mary and James remained in correspondence, but when she was executed on February 8th, 1587, the king was only 20 years old, and he hadn't seen his mother since he was a newborn, if indeed that even counts. In the subsequent decades, James maintained close relations with Elizabeth I, whom he addressed variously in their letters as mighty princess, madame, sister, cousin, and even mother, demonstrating his multi-layered strategy of ingratiating himself with the Queen. He carefully styled himself as a Protestant crusader, and beginning in 1601, he began consultations in secret with Robert Cecil, the Queen's Secretary of State, whom James I would keep on when he became king, and we see him there, the first in the row on the right. So around this time, James also wrote two important books that would help to pave his way. The first was The True Law of Free Monarchies, an impassioned defense of the divine right of kings that established a theological basis for royal power. The second was the aforementioned Basilican Doron, a series of letters addressed to the king, by the king to Henry, his dearest son and natural successor. Now, what's interesting is that the British Library holds the original manuscript, which is composed in Middle Scots in the king's handwriting. James would later explain that he wrote it in secret and had not intended for public consumption. When it was published in 1599, only 7 copies were printed, but they moved around quite quickly, and people, including his enemies, were able to read it right away. Moreover, the language had been anglicized in the printed edition, leading one scholar to conclude that despite the king's protestations, it was intended from the outset to be an open secret. So why all this pretense? Well, to put it into contemporary perspective, When politicians publish memoirs and other books in the run-up to a major election, they are familiarizing the public with their personal stories and ideological agendas in an attempt to make themselves seem more fit for office. Dreams from my father, faith of my fathers, promise me dad, where do we go from here? United and a more perfect union. These might as well have been taglines for the Basilican Doran. The king's publications in the 1590s were focused on the art of statecraft. However, if the true law of free monarchies was full of complex theological and legal arguments, the king's gift, in contrast, was written in a more direct and conversational style. The handwritten draft was composed when Henry was only 4 years old. But when his father ascended the throne, the English throne in 1603, some 16,000 copies would flood the market. It became an international hit and was quickly translated into several foreign languages. One historian even compared it to a commemorative coronation mug. It was the thing to buy in 1603. But what exactly was the Basilican Doran about, and why did it become so successful? On the surface, it was a book of fatherly wisdom. It consisted of 3 chapters or books with advice on how to be a good Christian before God, how to be a good king, and how not to become a tyrant. And finally, how to be a good person, from the kind of wife one should choose down to fashion tips from dad. Scholars have pointed out that James may have been inspired by a series of letters written by the Habsburg Emperor Charles V to his son, Philip II, the King of Spain. But the genre of letters to my son is something that literary historians can trace from antiquity right down to Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, or on a lighter, though no less political note, Ali Wong's Dear Girls, addressed to her daughters. The King's Gift appealed to an early modern readership for both intellectual and more voyeuristic reasons. On the one hand, it offered a handy synthesis of various texts, cherry-picking ideas and sayings from Plato's Republic down to Machiavelli's The Prince. On the other hand, it was full of personal anecdotes and wit, and the intimate fatherly tone gave the reader an impression of listening in on the private conversations, aspirations, and concerns of an otherwise untouchable celebrity. So riding on this wave of optimism in the spring of 1603, Henry Peacham, an overworked and underpaid schoolmaster, suddenly found himself with the rare opportunity to meet the new king as he passed through Huntingdon on his way to London. On that occasion, he presented sorry to see the baby go because it's almost like the invocation of the prince. On that occasion, he presented, it's okay. On that occasion, he presented James I with some emblems that he had designed. This exchange inspired Peacham to compose an entire emblem book based on the king's bestseller, which he hoped would land him a permanent position in the king's court. So, all of these emblem books were really a means to, it's almost like a grant proposal, I suppose. He wanted to get into James I's court. We do not know how James responded. We do know, however, that poor Peacham remained stuck in his day job, where, according to his own laments to the king, he had to suffer, and I quote, "the noise and chatter of children everywhere," end quotes. And this, for those of you who are students and scholars in the audience, never complain in a grant application. Okay, the king undoubtedly also had other more important things on his mind than Peacham's emblem books. His procession, scheduled for 1603, had been delayed by, of all things, a pandemic. In fact, one of the very first things that the king did was to implement a clear set of rules to contain the plague. Houses of the infected were to be locked down for 6 weeks. If the sick had to leave the house, they were required to mark their clothes so that other people would know to keep at a distance. And of course, donations were collected to assist the poor and afflicted. When the celebrations finally took place safely on March 15, 1604, there was, as one would expect, general rejoicing in the streets, accompanied by fireworks, river pageants, and the liberal distribution of wine. The word claret appears in the primary sources quite a lot. Various groups in London sponsored temporary triumphal arches along the processional route to welcome the new king. The one we see on screen was constructed by the Dutch community in London and appears in Stephen Harrison's book commemorating that day. Harrison was one of the architects overseeing the event. A last-minute arch was put up by the City of Westminster and the Duchy of Lancaster. But of course, sadly, this hasty addition was not illustrated with the other 7 arches by Harrison. Luckily, however, Thomas Dekker, who was another one of the men involved in the production, described it in a book that he put out to capitalize on the occasion. The 8th arch, Dekker tells us, featured a rainbow, held aloft by 2 obelisks, surrounded by the sun, the moon, and stars. Electra, the goddess of the storm clouds, appeared on a comet to announce that His Majesty had brought peace to the city and had freed it from, quote, the noise of tumult, end quote. This rainbow arch would have been the last apparatus that the king would have seen that day and under which his carriage would have been drawn as he left the city before arriving at his residence, Whitehall Palace. As with Peacham's rainbow emblem, one is curious to know what the king would have thought of this spectacle. While the king relished his reputation as a peacemaker and unifier, actually maintaining peace and unity was a different matter, and he quickly proved himself incapable of the task. James I almost immediately alienated himself from many of his new subjects by proclaiming himself the King of Great Britain. Not everyone was for unification, and indeed, many Englishmen thought that the Scots were lowly foreigners. Protestant and Catholic factions maneuvered into position against each other and against the new union of the crowns. Over the course of the next years, thousands of pages would be devastated and buckets of ink would be spilled over the contentious phrase, Great Britain. In fact, the nation would not adopt this name officially until the Act of Union in 1707. And so here, I guess we have Brexit version 1.0. In the 1610s, James I would face 2 further challenges. The first came in 1612 when his dearest son and natural successor, Prince Henry, suddenly died from typhoid fever at the age of 18 to the great sorrow of the nation. Henry had always been more popular than his father. One contemporary described him as, quote, so fair a fortune, so royal a hope, and a prince of so unusual strain and expectation, end quote. Henry's allegiance to the Protestant cause against Spain and Rome was more steadfast. He had established a thriving court at Richmond Palace, full of art and learning, and he projected an image of competence and commitment that his father somehow lacked. Henry's death embodied what the historian Roy Strachan has characterized as England's lost Renaissance. The second challenge James I had to confront was the ongoing hostilities between Spain and the newly established United Provinces of the Dutch Republic. In the end, Rex Pacificus opted for appeasement and payouts rather than achieving any lasting peace. And as his reign lost the initial glow of novelty, and as the obstacles and opposition began to mount, he became more and more withdrawn, preferring to spend time on lawn hunting vacations away from his duties or with one of his many young, handsome court favorites, somewhere over the rainbow. James I could still play the occasional hero in blatant anti-Catholic political allegories, however. They're the King James I's favorites. James I could still play the occasional hero in blatant anti-Catholic allegories. In this detail here, we find him surrounded by the most important VIPs of the Protestant movement in Europe. We find Maurice and Frederick Henry, the Princes of Orange and leaders of the Dutch revolt against the Spanish. We find Frederick V, electorate of the Palatinate, and James's son-in-law, and the young King of France, Louis XIII. Then the other half of this composition, we see Isabella and Albert, the Habsburg regents of the Spanish Netherlands, and a crowded mess of Catholics. One might think initially that the rainbow here is a sign of peace, reaching across to bridge the gulf between the two religious factions. However, if we look carefully at the background, we will notice immediately that it is raining on the side of the Catholics, but sunny on the side of the Protestants. On the left, the boats with men in black retrieve people in a calm, orderly manner, whereas on the right, the scramble onto the vessels is made comical by large corpulent bodies and a ton of liturgical paraphernalia that threaten to capsize the whole thing. One swimmer in the foreground, facing out towards us, seems to be abandoning the Catholic cause and swimming now to the other side. For the Dutch Protestant artist of this painting, Adrian van de Ven, the rainbow was indeed a very political symbol. But before we come to the end, let me address something many of you may have already noticed: the chromatic inconsistency of the rainbow. Until Isaac Newton successfully demonstrated in the 1660s how white light could be split into its constituent parts, there was no agreement on how many and which colors appeared in the rainbow. And here I would really love to thank the organizers of today's events for these wonderful prisms outside that helped demonstrate Newton's experiment. One doesn't usually get swag at academic talks, so I'm very grateful for that. So how many colors? Which ones? Aristotle asserted that there were 3 bands, red, green, and violet. In the Middle Ages, however, there were often 4. Isidore of Seville saw red, purple, black, and white. But for the Venerable Bede, it was red, blue, green, and brown. In an Italian Renaissance dialogue, it becomes red, white, and green. There are numerous other such combinations, but time is short. In Van de Ven's landscape, it is blue, green, and yellow. And this combination was interesting to me because I remembered I had come across it in 2 very different 17th century English texts of the early Stuart monarchy. The first passage appears in Joshua Sylvester's translation of a popular biblical epic by the French Protestant author Guillaume du Bartas. Sylvester, all but forgotten today, would become the first poet pensioner in Prince Henry's court in Richmond. The second text is from a sermon delivered on June 10th, 1617, by a newly appointed preacher, Emmanuel Bourne, in a sermon delivered in the open-air pulpit just outside St. Paul's Cathedral. And I won't go into details here. If anyone is interested, I can give you the references later. But let me simply point out in closing that the poet and the preacher both identified blue, green, and yellow as the 3 colors of the rainbow. But something curious happens to the color yellow, which is described in other instances as gold, but also as red and even white. This bizarre conflation is explained once we realize that this changeable red, white, yellow color refers in fact to the color of fire as it flickers and glows. And herein lies the key to this unusual color symbolism, at once ecological and eschatological. Blue, we are told, represents water and the flood that came before. Green is the present state of mercy in which we now dwell. And the golden light belongs to the hellfires to come in the end times. Sylvester describes this concisely as, quote, the judgment past and the judgment yet to come, end quote. For the new Stuart monarchy, these were portentous messages indeed. In Book 2 of the Basilican Doran, as in Peacham's emblem, the greatest sin a king can commit is to become a tyrant. The rainbow was a reminder of the challenges one would face in balancing justice with mercy. Kingship was, in James's own words, an onus rather than an onos. That's Latin for a burden rather than an honor. The promise of the Jacobean Renaissance that was to be ushered in by James I and Prince Henry vanished as quickly as it appeared, just like a rainbow. On January 30th, 1649, James's successor, Charles I, would be the first European regent of the early modern period to be charged with treason against his own state and sentenced to death by his own subjects. The rainbow may have been a sign of empowerment for some, but for others, it was a formidable warning against tyrants. I end then, as I began, by posing the question, how does our comprehension of the past inform our experience of the present? And how can the present enhance our experience of the past? It is easy to say history matters, and it does. But I hope at least this afternoon to have demonstrated to you how and why. Thank you.
Maria, that was so wonderful.
Thank you.
And I'm just trying to imagine, we didn't actually work out our masking script up here. So maybe I'll just say a few words. I'm sure that everyone was thinking, Roy G. Biv, when is she going to say Roy G. Biv? If that's how you learned the colors of the rainbow. Or alternatively, something I think my 7th grade science teacher used, which was rolling over yon green bug I vomited. Equally memorable. I have to say, I was also thinking of the power of the devastating torrential storm and imagining that yesterday across the state of Kentucky, that after so many terrible tornadoes ripped apart people's lives, that perhaps a rainbow appeared because it's a front. And if there's rain and then sun, one does get the experience of the rainbow and this sense of a kind of scorched earth out of which the rainbow also appears, which I think is one of its characteristics. There's so much more that you and I can talk about because the great scene that is made in 1572 of the arriving Spaniards conquering Mexico takes place. It's made in 1572, but it's referring to 1519, and it takes place under the rainbow. So it is that kind of, some might say it's a bridge to nowhere, as well as a bridge between a kind of past and presentness. I'm happy to start by taking questions in the room and thinking there's just so much history to knit together here, and we're going to get some help with, should I bring my phone up so I can be Slacked, read Slack questions or not from Zoom? Okay.
Can I say a quick word about
Yeah, please come talk.
I wanted just to say a quick word about Roy G. Biv. So Roy G. Biv is something that I grew up with, but then I asked around and it didn't turn out to be as universal as I thought it was. In England, they have a different saying, which I can't recall right now, a different mnemonic trick to remember it. And Roy G. Biv is something we learned, but I think afterwards, I asked my young brother who's here, and he had not learned that. So it's something that belongs to us, but not everyone, funnily enough.
I also learned a song, perhaps in the 1st grade, which is how many colors are in the rainbow, how many colors are in the rainbow. and I forget, it ends with red and blue and green, is the last three colors. So we were supposed to learn it to a tune. And you know, it's a kind of interesting thing that this was important factual information that needed to be conveyed to small fry in the same way that, say, the names of the days of the week needed to be conveyed. You know, really, after 9th grade earth science, probably no one ever asked you again what the nature of the iris actually was. So,
Can I split this? No.
it'd be so nice if we could split it. So, there's a really wonderful question here that comes from Thisbe, whom many of you know from, who is here at the GRI. Catherine's rainbow is often accompanied by peacocks. And of course, they have a certain iridescence that almost is iris-like. So could you talk a little bit about their symbolism? So that's one. Two, you mentioned King James's preference for young male courtiers. Is there any connection with the rainbow taking on the LGBTQ association with this emblem?
Okay, thank you. How do we, can you hear me if I have my mask on? Okay, great. So with the peacocks. I'm going to be socially distanced over. Okay, so with peacocks, they are an attribute of the goddess Juno. So Juno often comes with the rainbow because Iris, the goddess of the rainbow, is her messenger. So when bad news comes, Juno will send Iris to inform people that you know, they're going to die in a war, etc. So that's why you have the combination of the peacock with Juno and with the rainbow, and rolled into Catherine de' Medici's iconography. The iridescence of the peacock does play into that imagery as well. Okay, so that was the first question. The second question on James I. I'm sorry the slides slightly slipped out of order when I was on that part. Michael Young and, gosh, I've now blanked on the other name, but there are two very important studies on James I's homosexuality, and this is something that scholars have explored and have challenged as well. I don't think there was any LGBTQ connection between the rainbow emblem and James's love for his court favorites. So that's a history that comes later. For those of you who are interested, the history of the LGBTQ flag comes from 1978. It was designed by a man named Gilbert Baker, who originally had, I believe, 8 stripes on it. I think there's 6 stripes on it now, but there were 8 stripes initially, and each stripe, of course, had a symbolism. It initially had a hot pink fuchsia stripe at the top, which symbolized sex. I think red must have symbolized love, and so on and so forth. I've forgotten the exact references. There was also a turquoise stripe that represented magic, which later on got conflated into blue and indigo. The reason why fuchsia was actually deleted from the flag was because hot pink dye is really expensive. And so it was actually a monetary reason that it was then taken away, and the other colors were conflated into 6 stripes. So that's a very interesting history, the history of the LGBTQ flag. It wasn't commissioned, but it was Harvey Milk who asked Gilbert Baker to design the flag in 1978 for the Gay Pride Parade, and it was subsequently adopted as the official kind of insignia. So that's the larger history of that.
Well, Maria, I'm hoping you can also say a little bit more about Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition, but then I invite people to come down and ask questions from the audience. After you say a little bit about the Rainbow Coalition, we'll take a question from Andrew Perchak.
Okay, so on Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, this is also another adoption of the rainbow symbolism for political activism. I mean, in the 20th century, that is a very common point of reference. And I think one of the things I really wanted to emphasize is that, you know, rainbows are signs of hope and joy and peace. But it's always, the kind of flip side of hope, joy, and peace is the anxiety and the disruption that kind of precedes the moment of stability. And so that kind of two-sided or double-ended, the two ends of the rainbow are about balance of trying to maintain, of trying to maintain that tenuous balance. So, Andrew.
Questions are coming in on Zoom, and if you're in our Zoom audience, please continue to send questions in on Zoom. Andrew?
Thanks, Maria, for a terrific talk. I wondered if you'd give us some more thoughts about the rainbow and gender. I mean, as you know, female power was a very complex issue during the Renaissance. Elizabeth I very frequently did not use feminine pronouns and often referred to herself as prince or other. Isabella d'Este did something very similar when she was, for a time, leading, and how the rainbow may figure into with the idea that female power was something of an impossibility.
Okay, great. That's a wonderful question. With the portrait, the famous rainbow portrait of Elizabeth I, what's really interesting about that bow is the way she's kind of holding it, almost like a weapon. It's almost like a blade, even. And her rainbow is this kind of golden color that is almost like a thunderbolt. And if you think of that imagery of, kind of holding forward of that kind of meteorological explosion, you think of Jupiter. So in that gesture, there is a kind of doubling of the imagery that is at once a rainbow, but also invoking Jupiter. So she's at once the god of the gods and the goddess of the goddesses. So she is channeling that. I think Elizabeth was always they before anyone else could even think of it. And she had to be. She was unwed, and she, she's coming after a incredibly repressive Catholic monarchy that is her predecessor, Mary Tudor. And, she's trying to keep everything together with everyone trying to take it apart. So there is that sense of Elizabeth being both genderless and all genders at once. And I do think that the rainbow, especially in that portrait, is held in this manner that is very Jupiter-like, if you want to put it that way.
Our next question comes from Zoom. I now have my own microphone.
Okay.
And it's a bit of a meteorological question, and I think I would simply ask you as well if you might talk a bit about the nature of the depiction of clouds in many of these images, because they strike me as, in a kind of superficial way, as strange, almost animate forms. And it's hard to know, are they based on something else? They remind me a bit of Buddhist clouds. They remind me of Aztec clouds. These are, there are the interesting clouds. But the question is a little bit about the meteorological phenomenon. What do people know about rainbows and why they exist? Asks Amy Gillette. I'm paraphrasing her question here. And then to move on from the kind of flat-footed meteorological way that I've posed this, were they making references to celestial versus the meteorological rainbows? And how about rainbows in medieval mystery plays and spectacles? And finally, what's your favorite rainbow in public space? So there are three questions. There's the kind of meteorological one. There's the medieval and celestial, and then medieval rainbows, and then your personal favorite rainbow.
Okay, meteorological rainbows. Aristotle lays out much of the science for rainbows in many of his writings, his scientific writings. the issue of Renaissance meteorology has been very expertly analyzed by an author named Craig Martin. I believe the book is actually called Italian Renaissance Meteorology. So I encourage the person who asked the question to chase that up. In terms of what they knew about the rainbow, the idea of one of the things that we find is a lot of discussion about how they appear, under what circumstances they appear. And for a very long time, it was thought that when clouds are present, the light would kind of hit against the clouds and then reflect, creating a rainbow. But that was later discounted. The presence of the clouds in a more pictorial and iconographical circumstance is tied perhaps to a passage in Ovid. I don't know if this is the one and only source, but there's a tradition from Ovid's Metamorphoses that explains how the rainbow has to kind of almost drink up the liquids, the moisture, the water in the air, in order to then replenish the earth. And this is why the rainbow is also, in some instances, tied to symbolism of fertility, that links it to fertility. This idea of kind of drinking up all of the water and then replenishing the earth with it, of raining down upon it. So that's why you sometimes see those two clouds hanging at either end. It's almost like hands pulling the water out. A very visual way of doing that. Medieval rainbows. Yes, there are lots of medieval rainbows, and usually bad things are happening when rainbows show up. As I said earlier, and I didn't have enough time to have too many images, but there are lots of rainbows in Last Judgment scenes. God always appears, when rainbows appear, God is usually sitting on it as a judge, which is why the whole theme of justice and judgment is tied to the rainbow as well. And of course, you get it throughout the imagery of the Book of Revelations, St. John's various apocalyptic visions. I remember reading at some point that in one of the Protestant tracts, I can't remember right now off the top of my head which one, but there is a reference that there will not be a rainbow seen for 40 years before the apocalypse. So let's keep hoping we see rainbows in the next few years. Now, my favorite rainbow, I don't know, that's a really difficult one to say. I mean, I'm quite fond of the Van de Ven, the crazy a yellow, green, blue rainbow, but there are many. I think that's a difficult one to answer.
Carrie?
Hello, Carrie.
I had a question on, since rainbows seem to show kind of a portents for bad things happening, when did it change to, when I grew up, rainbows led to a pot of gold? Yeah. So I was just wondering when that would kind of change, that thought of rainbows.
Yes. I think I was speaking earlier to Fiona about German Romanticism. I think German Romanticism has a lot to do in that regards, because with German Romanticism, you have a much more emotional kind of connection with nature and with landscape. And from that period onwards, you have you have some positive rainbow imagery in the past as well, but certainly with Romanticism and this kind of appreciation for the wonders and beauties of nature, you have a much more positive, affirmative relationship with that. I'm not entirely sure about the pot of gold. That is something I will have to chase up, but I imagine that must be, I don't know, off the top of my head, I would imagine it might be a kind of Victorian fantasy, but I don't know. Yeah. Oh, yes, of course, yes.
There are a couple of people who've written in to say that in the English context, Roy G. Biv stands for Richard of York gave battle in vain. So it actually is a sentence as opposed to a name. Any other questions next from the audience? We have more coming in on Zoom. Could you talk a little bit about rainbows in 18th and 19th century art?
Sadly, I cannot. What can I say about rainbows in 18th and 19th century art? I mean, I think there's a moment after Isaac Newton explains the science behind prisms. behind prisms, that there is a renewed interest in...
Oh, you brought a prism with you?
Yes, well, no, they're outside. There were some prisms outside, so I brought one in.
Oh, wonderful.
So there is an interest in that afterwards. There's actually a really wonderful, let me see if I can get this right, 19th century French print that is in the special collections in the GRI, and I wish I could remember all the details about it right now, but it actually is a wonderful ecological/political allegory, and it shows Iris, who is depicted as a young kind of naked nymph at the end of the rainbow. You know, Iris is the goddess of the rainbow, and it's a print about this big. And at the other end of the rainbow, it ends up in a kind of industrial scene with pollution, and the whole idea is that the pollution is destroying the rainbow. And the version in the Getty is actually the best one because it's in black and white, and you really get the kind of materiality of that, you know, shift from nature to pollution in the black and white version. At the Met, they have a colored version, which is really kind of awful because it's just the colors are too bright and gory, and it doesn't quite work. You don't have the kind of, I don't know, the stark poetry and the poignancy of this rainbow arching into this kind of industrial wasteland at the other end. So that's what I can say about 18th and 19th century rainbows. One of the prints is here at the Getty, and the other one in color is at the Met for whoever is interested in the later rainbows.
I should also just say that there are many comments coming in about what a wonderful lecture this has been. So I want you.
Thank you.
I want you to hear that from.
I'm exceedingly grateful to the Getty for having arranged this because, you know, this is my first talk in I don't know how many years. I wasn't entirely sure I'd be able to stand for 45 minutes, much less speak for that long. So thank you so much.
So there are some more questions. Is the rainbow ever adopted by the Medici family? And what about Margherita d'Austria?
I don't think so. I don't know. I would have to go through a lot more Medicis to see if anybody uses it, but I don't have any memory of it. That doesn't mean there isn't. I just don't know the answer to that.
Well, there are a lot of rainbows.
Yeah.
And we didn't hear from Kermit.
Yes, we didn't. Well, yes.
Well, the Rainbow Connection, I think
Yes.
that was one of your titles. And I will say that I think many of us are going to be looking for your rainbow font in writing our correspondence. Another question that comes in is whether you could talk about the depiction of rainbows in antiquity. And this follows particularly on the explications, your excellent explications of the representations of Catherine in conjunction with her son Charles, which seems to follow certain traditions of intergenerational familial representation in ancient Rome.
Wow, okay. I will need another PhD. I will need another grant from the Getty to come here as a scholar to do 2 years of research, and then I can probably answer that question in a more satisfactory manner. But yes, I mean, I tried to do a word search through the Loeb Classical Library for rainbow, and almost all of the references that come up are in one way or another, either from Aristotle or responding to Aristotle's more meteorological analyses of the rainbow. So I don't know about rainbows in ancient dynastic imagery, iconography, but that's something I'll certainly keep an eye out for. It would be interesting to know. I mean, because rainbows are classified with comets and hail and all these other kind of meteorological kind of oddities for a lot of the pre-modern period. Hail. If you don't have a clearly articulated explanation for gravity, hail is still a terrifying thing when it comes suddenly out of nowhere and is painful. So, one of the things I'm really interested in thinking about representations of the sky in the pre-modern era is to think about this vast space for projection, both of hope but also of anxieties. That's not exactly answering the question about rainbows in antiquity, but again, I'm sorry, I don't have enough knowledge about the ancient traditions to know about the dynastic connections in Roman portraiture.
Well, this has been a wonderful afternoon. You know, it's so satisfying to see the possibilities of the hybrid conversation, so that colleagues are talking with you this afternoon from around Southern California, from perhaps just 2 miles away, and also here. It is extraordinary. And I think it's just so satisfying to take apart an image that we find disarmingly soothing when it is not, and to think about the power inherent in such a really terrifying meteorological phenomenon. You know, if you've ever been in the middle of a very bright rainbow, it is actually quite a scary thing to have happening around you. And I suspect that there is a sense, not just of awe, but of feeling as though you are communicating with the divine in some powerful way when you are in that, close to that sharply defined set of color in a way that, you know, we're so used to seeing all this color in the world, but you're a peasant. You don't have access to this except the stained glass in your church.
Yeah, you don't have an iPhone. So there's something about the fragility and the kind of flash. It's there and then it's gone. And, you know, you kind of have to remember
and
it in
has
your own
brought
mind's
you
eye.
into that magnificence of the cathedral when you are in that rainbow itself. And I feel that we have been in your wonderful, well, I guess I'll just call it a halo this afternoon. So thank you so much, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for this wonderful stage set. I couldn't have asked for a better design. Thank you.